thank you very much, and I'm very delighted to join my colleague, Monsieur Nadeau, today in presenting our delegation report, as you've heard, on our humanitarian fact-finding mission to Gaza and the West Bank in August of this year. And just to give some context to this, when we were in Gaza, we heard that we are likely the first elected Canadian representatives to visit Gaza since 2003. And in fact, we believe that the last visit by a Canadian elected representative was Jean Chrétien. We went to Gaza particularly because we wanted to witness firsthand what we understood to be the deteriorating humanitarian disaster in Gaza as a result of the blockade and the bombing that took place in December and January of this year. We were only in Gaza for a brief time. It was very difficult for us to get in. We had no assistance from the Canadian government. They did help facilitate our trip to the West Bank, but they provided no assistance to enable us to go to Gaza. So we took a very circuitous route. We entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing in Egypt. We were only there for a short time, 24 hours, but I have to say that for me, and I think for Richard as well, it was probably the most intense 24 hours that we have ever experienced. We were hosted by UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief Works Agency, and when we were in Gaza, we were very, very struck by the terrible situation that is being faced by 1.5 million people who live there. It has been described by many as the world's largest open-air prison. Movement is virtually impossible across the borders. Because of the blockade, there are only about 35 different kinds of goods, essential goods, that are allowed, and as a result, we've seen a big increase in underground tunnels that are illegal, because that's the only way that people are surviving. I do want to just very briefly touch on the recommendations that are in our report, and they are throughout the report, but they are amalgamated on page 20 if you want to look at them in total. We have 7 recommendations. These recommendations are directed to the Canadian government and to members of Parliament, and I think most of all, we want members of Parliament to understand what is taking place in this part of the world. We want people to understand and to not be afraid to speak out about the disaster that is taking place and the fact that the ongoing occupation of these lands by Israel is something that must be addressed. So we are speaking to our fellow parliamentarians as well as to Canadian society generally, and we have made these recommendations to the government, and many of our recommendations, ironically, are based on existing policy that you can actually read word for word on the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade website. However, we think that there's a big difference between what's on paper and what Canada claims its policy is and what's actually being done or not done by the Conservative government. So very briefly, our recommendations, our first recommendation is that we want our Canadian government to be much more assertive and positive in supporting the U.S. Obama administration and encouraging further progress on a peace plan for the Middle East. When we were there, we heard from many people who were very hopeful at that time that the change in the U.S. administration would finally bring some progress towards a peace plan. I think since we returned, and we've been, of course, receiving emails and following news reports, we feel that some of that optimism and hope that people expressed to us has been sliding and dissipating. But nevertheless, our main recommendation is that the Canadian government must be doing everything it can to support what the U.S. is doing for a lasting peace plan and process. Our second recommendation concerns the support to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency. We are very, very concerned that the Canadian government has not delivered its commitment based on funding that was provided last year for this for the next fiscal year. We heard this from many people, and we're very thankful that the Group of 78, which is a very notable group of informed people here in Ottawa, have written a letter to the Prime Minister. It's contained in an appendix to the report. And so we're very concerned that UNRWA will not be able to do the absolutely essential work that it is doing, both in the West Bank and particularly in Gaza, unless it receives its full funding commitment. So we're calling on the government to ensure that they deliver an amount equal to or greater than the contribution that was given in 2008. We also have recommendations to the government about the barrier wall. We saw the impact of the wall both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and we're very concerned that that Canada's stated position to oppose the barrier wall inside the West Bank and East Jerusalem is not being carried out. And so again, we believe that the government must affirm its commitment to the stated policies that Canada has. We did visit the village of Berlin, where there have been weekly peaceful demonstrations taking place about the construction of the barrier wall that intersects the village and its land, and was the subject of a litigation in Israel, where the village actually was able to gain an order from the High Court of Justice in Israel, but it has never been implemented. And again, we are calling on the government of Canada to speak out in support of this decision that was made, and to affirm that the use of nonviolent means by which civilians are able to protest is allowed to take place. We're very concerned about the situation in Berlin, and that people are being arrested, they're being harassed by Israeli defense forces. We also have recommendations about the settlement activity, which I won't go through but are available to see. And we also have recommendations about the blockade in Gaza. And quite simply put, we are saying that the blockade must end. Canada cannot allow the deteriorating humanitarian disaster in this area to continue. We had a very rare glimpse into the area around the illegal tunnels. We were told that there were at one point 1,000 tunnels. There's now about 700. They are dangerous. They are regularly bombed. People have died in the tunnels. But we learned that the goods of everyday life are going through these tunnels. This is what people have to rely on. And so to us, this says very strongly that unless there is some normalization at the border crossings, and people are allowed to come and go as they would in any other border, unless the blockade is ended, then we are basically condemning a civilian population to a life of misery and pain and suffering as a result of a politically imposed blockade. So we're saying to our government, they have to pay attention to this, and not only ensure that UNRWA has its necessary funding, but they should be also speaking out to end the blockade. We also heard about changes in regulations in Israel that are preventing Canadian citizens of Palestinian origin from being able to enjoy the same rights of passage across borders that would be granted to other Canadian citizens. So this is something that we believe the government should deal with. And finally, we have a couple of recommendations around international trade, and we're very concerned that under the Canada-Israel Free Trade Act or agreement, that there may be goods coming in that have come from the illegally occupied areas, and we're calling on the government of Canada to make an assessment of that and to ensure that these are excluded, that these areas are excluded from the trade agreement. So that's very briefly a highlight of our recommendations.